Welcome to the Explainer. So, today we're tackling something that honestly strikes pure dread into the hearts of parents everywhere, and that is flying with an anxious child. Look, if you've ever had to deal with a midair meltdown at 30,000 feet, you know exactly the kind of stress I'm talking about. But we're not just going to sit here and swap anecdotal parenting hacks today. We're actually going to completely demystify the absolute terror kids can face when they fly, and we'll anchor our practical tips in real clinical adult science. So, let's just dive right in and figure out how to turn your next family flight from a literal nightmare into a smooth ride.
So first things first, why do kids hate flying so much? Well, if you think about it, flying demands a highly unusual, honestly kind of unfair bargain from a child. We're asking them to hand over absolutely all of their control, stay tightly strapped into a seat, and just blindly trust a bunch of incredibly loud noises when they can't even see what's causing them. For a child whose main job in life is just figuring out how the physical world works, that kind of environment is deeply, deeply unsettling.
Let's look at the anatomy of this flight anxiety, starting with what we'll call the elevator analogy. To really get this, we kind of have to step into a child's shoes for a second. Imagine you're in an elevator. Suddenly, there's a huge unexplained bang, or maybe this weird mechanical whirring sound you've literally never heard before. Your heart's gonna skip a beat, right? But you know you'll be out of there in 10 seconds. Now, imagine that exact same feeling of panic, but you can't get out for 4 hours. See, as adults, we know what the landing gear retracting sounds like. But to a child, a sudden unexplained bang mid-climb is just pure evidence that something has gone terribly wrong and they have absolutely nowhere to escape to. And that brilliantly illustrates our first major strategy. You see, an unpredicted noise is processed by the brain as a threat. But a predicted noise, that gets processed as information. If you narrate those noises before they even happen, like telling your kid, okay, in just a minute, we're going to hear a really loud engine surge because the plane needs to go fast. Or, hey, you're going to hear a heavy clunk when the wheels go up. You are transforming a scary threat into comforting information. It's like you're handing them the script before the play even begins.
All right, moving on to 3 actionable steps for kids when preparing for the flight.
Knowing how powerful information is, let's look at some evidence-based steps you can actually take, which are heavily drawn from procedural preparation research. The absolutely crucial thing to remember here is that the flight actually starts way before you step onto the plane. Airports are basically a 2-hour ramp-up of stress. You're queuing for security, you're getting separated from your bags, you're navigating these massive crowds, and you're having to follow weird instructions from total strangers. That whole sequence absolutely exhausts kids. A lot of children who, quote-unquote, hate flying are actually completely spent before they even lay eyes on the airplane. You've got to rehearse this entire sequence with them at home. Walk them through exactly what security will look like, how boarding works, what buckling that seatbelt is going to feel like. Preparation is actually the best supported principle in the entire child anxiety literature.
Next up, you've got to hand back some autonomy. Giving kids back these small controllables directly counteracts that terrifying loss of control they feel when they're strapped in. Let them choose between the window or the aisle seat. Let them pack their own little carry-on bag. Let them pick their specific flight snack, or even decide exactly when they want to put their headphones on. It seems super small, right? But giving them these little choices builds a literal fortress of control in a highly uncontrollable environment.
But we need to talk about the reassurance trap and what actually makes things worse.
This is where we so often trip up as caregivers. It's a completely counterintuitive parental instinct that actually sabotages the child's ability to cope. We've all said this. It's fine, it's totally safe, don't worry. But researchers warn us about this weird loop payoff. If you repeat that phrase 20 times, you aren't calming your kid down. You're actually actively transferring your own anxiety to them. You're teaching them that this situation is so sketchy it requires constant checking. Basically, you're telling them, hey, this is so incredibly dangerous that I have to remind you every 30 seconds that you aren't going to die. Not great, right? The best approach? Just say it once with calm confidence and then immediately move on to the next actionable thing you can both do.
Let's shift gears now and look at the adult science behind this, specifically graded exposure. I want to honestly frame the evidence here. The highly structured steps we just talked about for kids, those are preparation principles. But the really heavy-hitting clinical science backing all this actually comes from adult treatments. The absolute gold standard for treating specific situational phobias, like the fear of flying, is called graded exposure. This basically involves gradual, repeated confrontation with whatever you're afraid of, while intentionally staying in that situation instead of just running away. That process trains the brain that the situation is actually safe. But let's be real. Traditionally, doing this for flying is incredibly tough. It's wildly expensive and just practically difficult to practice on real airplanes. Which brings us to digital cures for phobias and the fascinating No Fear Airlines trial. This is one of the most interesting studies in recent psychological research. Researchers gathered 69 adult participants, all of whom had a diagnosed specific flying phobia. And they tested them using a personal computer program literally called No Fear Airlines. Now, this wasn't some insanely expensive sci-fi virtual reality rig. It was just a smart, internet-based program that provided specific images and real, high-quality sounds of flying.
To see how well it actually worked, they split these folks into 3 groups. Group 1 used the No Fear program totally self-applied, meaning entirely on their own. Group 2 used the program but had minimal therapist guidance, which basically just meant a short 5-minute weekly phone call for encouragement. And Group 3 was just a waitlist control group. The big question researchers wanted to answer was, is a human therapist actually necessary for this kind of digital exposure to work? So the program walked participants through 6 multimedia scenarios, mimicking that exact same ramp-up we discussed for kids. It started with flight preparation, moved to the airport, then boarding and takeoff, the main flight, landing, and honestly, even dealing with air crash news. But here is the absolute genius part. The system would only advance to the next scenario when the patient's reported anxiety dropped below a 3 out of 10. They literally had to sit with that digital exposure until their brain recognized, okay, I am safe.
And the results were absolutely stark. Compared to the waitlist control group, both of the No Fear treatment groups saw massive, highly significant reductions in their fear of flying and their avoidance behaviors. The digital exposure worked, and it worked remarkably well.
But here is the really crucial point, and it's a total game changer for mental health accessibility. When they compared the totally self-applied group to the therapist-guided group, there was no significant difference in effectiveness post-treatment. Let that sink in. Doing it entirely alone on a computer was just as effective as having a therapist's weekly 5-minute support call.
And this brilliantly illustrates the long-term power of this method. These treatment gains, they weren't just some temporary boost. The exposure benefits, that reduced fear and the actual ability to get on a plane, were successfully maintained at both the 3-month and the 12-month follow-up marks. The brain learned a new baseline of safety, and it stuck.
So here's the big takeaway. Don't wait for it to be outgrown. What does all this adult clinical data mean for you and your family? Let's bring it back to reality. Here's your safety line. As a caregiver, you should never try to clinically diagnose your child yourself. But if your kid's fear of flying is getting so severe that it's literally canceling your family plans, or if you're noticing that fear generalizing into everyday things, like suddenly they're terrified of riding in cars or elevators, please don't just wait around hoping they outgrow it. As we've just seen, highly effective digital and therapist-guided exposure treatments exist out there. Professional help works, and it works incredibly well.
We've covered the science of fear, the real power of preparation, and the undeniable effectiveness of exposure therapy. So I'll leave you with this final thought. On your very next family trip, are you going to be empowering your kids by predicting the noises, or will you both just be sitting there anxiously waiting for the next bang? Use the tools, prepare the steps, and take back control of your fright. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and hey, safe travels out there.